infallible grasp of fact, which cooperated with some undefined power of controlling language melodiously, to give him his great reputation as an orator. It has been said that his power as an orator lay so largely in the musical tones of his voice that his speeches are, quote, not worth reading, end quote. But this is a radical mistake. A few of them are dull, and in none of them is there the systematic art which marshals every idea towards a final climax. Mr. Clay's climax is apt to come in the middle of his speech, as it is anywhere else, and after it is reached, it does strain the attention to go on following him through arguments on a lower plane than that to which he himself had elevated the mind. But when this is admitted, it still remains true that his best orations and hundreds of pages of others, which are not his best, easily command attention and excite warm admiration. He was greater as a statesman and political manager than he was as an orator, if oratory is to be judged by those severe classical standards of which he knew nothing. But he was eloquent by nature, a man of multitudinous ideas, of what Taine calls, quote, thronging imaginations, end quote, with a poetical sense of the beautiful, and with a musician's ear for the harmonies of language. The same training as a linguist which gave Erskine his sense of order in language might have made Clay the greatest orator of modern times. If, as Macaulay and Choate agree, that honor belongs to Edmund Burke, it is nevertheless certain that Clay will always be studied and admired as one of the greatest of those great orators whose eloquence, if it did not give them a permanent supremacy in history, made them preeminent in their own generations, with an influence reaching far into the generations after them. From the Compromise of 1850 until the close of the first 2 decades after the Civil War, it was not possible for justice to be done the fundamental idea Clay and Webster represented in their efforts to maintain the Union without bloodshed. Perhaps it is not possible yet, but it is no longer possible to hear Webster called a traitor to liberty in New England, or Clay denounced as a coward at the South. Both believed that there was no necessity whatever for Americans to fight each other, and that every issue it was possible to imagine could be settled better by evolution and the slow processes of intellectual and moral development than it could possibly be by force. Both held to the doctrine of non-intervention and laissez-faire, by which they meant they were bound to trust the innate good in human nature to work out reforms and to ensure continuous progress without violent attempts to accelerate it. This theory grew in popularity in England and America during the first quarter of the 19th century, but the Crimean War impaired its influence in England, while our own Civil War so weakened it that for nearly a generation it has been too much out of the public mind to be taken into general consideration as an explanation of the course followed by Clay and Webster in what have been denounced as their compromises of principle. In fact, compromise was with them a principle rather than a method. Those who hold that if the world is made freer, it will become better, that they do most for progress who do most to keep the peace, that a policy of cooperation between neighboring states and countries without the quote-unquote intervention of one to correct the domestic abuses of the other is the only mode of ensuring evolutionary and steady development, necessarily believe in the continuous concessions which their theory forces, even when the question is not merely of the weakness, but of the actual crimes of others beyond their jurisdiction. The opponents of this idea in America asserted the jurisdiction of every man born into the world to interfere wherever wrong was perpetrated against weakness. Quote, "Are we not our brother's keeper?" End quote, they said, summing up their creed in the question. The issue between two theories so antagonistic is not likely soon to be decided, but it must be understood before Clay's place in American history can be determined. From the time of the first Missouri Compromise, of which he has been called the chief designer, to the Compromise Tariff of 1833, and again up to the Compromise of 1850 and his death, Clay strove always to impress on the country his own governing idea that Americans of all sections were bound to tolerate each other in their mutual sins of ignorance, of lack of development, and of slowness to improve. Webster held with him, but in New England Webster was finally denounced as a renegade, and only a short time before the death of Clay, Mr. Jefferson Davis, listening to his pleas for the postponement of the crisis, concluded that it was cowardly for one generation to unload its responsibilities on the next, instead of meeting them at once. It is seldom desirable to attempt a judgment of what events might have been had they been what they were not, but nothing which has occurred or is likely to occur can permanently obscure the fact that the great Americans who believed in the slow processes of growth were not mere cowards vacillating in the presence of every crisis, but were consistent followers of an ideal. Perhaps Clay was too consistent when his habit of compromising public questions led him to commit himself against himself in his presidential canvasses, as he did when he lost the vote of New York and the presidency by a partial recession from his position of resistance to war with Mexico. But it is hardly to be expected that a man who had in him so little of bitterness, so much of the genial, the tolerant, the charitable, as Clay had, could force any issue radically. The ideas for which he stood as a constructive statesman were the use of all the powers of the federal government for internal improvements without being too strict in searching out constitutional objections, and after developing the internal trade of the country thus, to hold it against Europe, to give it commercial control of the hemisphere, and, by excluding European products, to stimulate, quote, competition in the home market, end quote. This he called, quote, the American system, end quote, and his policy of supporting the South American countries against Europe seemed to him to be a part of it. He was, however, fundamentally opposed to coercive government where coercion could be avoided, and his denunciations of Andrew Jackson were the result of inherent intellectual tendencies, not of the mere prejudices created by rivalry. Clay believed in republican institutions, but he believed government should be entrusted largely to those who shave regularly, bathe habitually, and do not ordinarily, quote, expectorate, end quote, on the floor in public places. This made him the fit leader, as it made him the idol of the, quote, gentleman's party, end quote, and naturally enough it brought him into the strongest antagonism with Jackson, who was accused by his enemies of smoking a corncob pipe, of sitting with his feet on the mantel, and of being a headstrong and violent advocate of the theory that, quote, everyone who did not interfere with his, Jackson's, own plans ought to be allowed the fullest liberty to interfere with those of other people, end quote. There was little of the laissez-faire in the policies of the man who hanged Arbuthnot and Armbruster first and considered the law points involved afterwards. He came into collision with Clay as logically as he did with Calhoun and Webster. However else these three remarkable men differed, they agreed in detesting the theory of government which Jackson represented as a leader of what it is said Miss Nellie Custis once called the, quote, dirty democracy, end quote. It is fortunate for the reader that it is possible to see the element of humor in such antagonisms as this. Otherwise, such lives as those of Clay and Webster, closing with the country on the verge of war and ending in what seemed complete failure, might seem sadder than they really were. For it is not yet demonstrated that they really did fail, or that those who force radical issues to immediate settlement are more successful in improving the world than those who hold what Clay proclaimed and Webster practiced. Clay entered national politics as a United States Senator from Kentucky in 1806. After serving until 1807, he retired and returned for another year of service in 1810. He was elected to the House of Representatives in 1811 and served, with an intermission of 2 years, until 1825. During 12 years of this period he was Speaker of the House. His candidacy for the presidency in 1824 was followed by his acceptance of the secretaryship of the state under John Quincy Adams, and his long quarrel with Jackson, whose supporters accused him of a corrupt bargain with Adams, by which they alleged that their favorite was cheated out of the presidency. From that period until his death, Mr. Clay was charged with being, and probably was, continuously a candidate for the presidency. In 1832 and again in 1844, he was a nominee of the Whig party, defeated, as some have said, by his own disposition to compromise, rather than by the inherent weakness of his party. He died in the city of Washington, June 29, 1852, after being more enthusiastically admired in all sections of the Union than any other American had been since the time of Washington. Dictators in American Politics. Denouncing Andrew Jackson, delivered in the United States Senate on the Poindexter Resolution, April 30th, 1834. Never, Mr. President, have I known or read of an administration which expires with so much agony and so little composure and resignation as that which now unfortunately has the control of public affairs in this country. It exhibits a state of mind, feverish, fretful, and fidgety, bounding recklessly from one desperate expedient to another, without any sober or settled purpose. Ever since the dog days of last summer, it has been making a succession of the most extravagant plunges, of which the extraordinary cabinet paper, a sort of appeal from a dissenting cabinet to the people, was the first, and the protest, a direct appeal from the Senate to the people, is the last and the worst. A new philosophy has sprung up within a few years past, called phrenology. There is, I believe, something in it, but not quite as much as its ardent followers proclaim. According to its doctrines, the leading passion, propensity, and characteristics of every man are developed in his physical conformation, chiefly in the structure of his head. Gall and Spurzheim, its founders or most eminent propagators, being dead, I regret that neither of them can examine the head of our illustrious chief magistrate. But if it could be surveyed by Dr. Caldwell of Transylvania University, I am persuaded that he would find the organ of destructiveness prominently developed. Except an enormous fabric of executive power for himself, the President has built up nothing, constructed nothing, and will leave no enduring monument of his administration. He goes for destruction, universal destruction, and it seems to be his greatest ambition to efface and obliterate every trace of the wisdom of his predecessors. He has displayed this remarkable trait throughout his whole life, whether in private walks or in the public service. He signally and gloriously exhibited that particular organ when contending against the enemies of his country in the Battle of New Orleans. For that brilliant exploit, no one has ever been more ready than myself to award him all due honor. At the head of our armies was his appropriate position, and most unfortunate for his fame was the day when he entered on the career of administration as the chief executive officer. He lives by excitement, perpetual, agitating excitement, and would die in a state of perfect repose and tranquility. He has never been without some subject of attack, either in individuals or in masses or in institutions. I myself have been one of his favorites, and I do not know but that I have recently recommended myself to his special regard. During his administration this has been his constant course. The Indians and Indian policy, internal improvements, the colonial trade, the Supreme Court, Congress, the bank, has successfully experienced the attacks of his haughty and imperious spirit, and if he tramples the bank in the dust, My word for it, we shall see him quickly in chase of some new subject of his vengeance. This is the genuine spirit of conquerors and of conquest. It is said by the biographer of Alexander the Great that, after he had completed his Asiatic conquests, he seemed to sigh because there were no more worlds for him to subdue, and, finding himself without further employment for his valor or his arms, he turned within himself to search for the means to gratify his insatiable thirst of glory. What sort of conquest he achieved of himself, the same biographer tragically records. Already has the President singled out and designated in the Senate of the United States the new object of his hostile pursuit, and the protest which I am now to consider is his declaration of war. What has provoked it? The Senate, a component part of the Congress of the United States, at its last adjournment, left the Treasury of the United States in the safe custody of the persons and places assigned by law to keep it. Upon reassembling, it found the Treasury removed, some of its guardians displaced, all remaining brought under the immediate control of the President's sole will, and the President having free and unobstructed access to the public money. The Senate believes that the purse of the nation is, by the Constitution and laws, entrusted to the exclusive legislative care of Congress. It has dared to avow and express this opinion in a resolution adopted on the 28th of March last. That resolution was preceded by a debate of 3 months' duration, in the progress of which the able and zealous supporters of the executive in the Senate were attentively heard. Every argument which their ample resources, or those of the members of the executive, could supply were listened to with respect and duly weighed. After full deliberation, the Senate expressed its conviction that the executive had violated the Constitution and laws. It cautiously refrained, in the resolution, from all examination into the motives or intention of the executive. It ascribed no bad ones to him. It restricted itself to a simple declaration of its solemn belief that the Constitution and laws had been violated. This is the extent of the offense of the Senate. This is what it has done to excite the executive indignation and to bring upon it the infliction of a denunciatory protest. The President comes down upon the Senate and demands that it record upon its journal this protest. He recommends no measure, no legislation whatever. He proposes no executive proceeding on the part of the Senate. He requests the recording of his protest, and he requests nothing more nor less. The Senate has abstained from putting on its own record any vindication of the resolution of which the President complains. It has not asked of him to place it, where he says he has put his protest, in the archives of the executive. He desires, therefore, to be done for him on the journal of the Senate what has not been done for itself. The Senate keeps no recording office for protests, deeds, wills, or other instruments. The Constitution enjoins that, quote, each house shall keep a journal of its proceedings, end quote. In conformity with this requirement, the Senate does keep a journal of its proceedings, not the proceedings of the executive or any other department of the government, except so far as they relate directly to the business of the Senate. The President sometimes professes to favor a strict construction of the Constitution, at least in regard to the powers of all the departments of the government other than that of which he is the chief. As to that, he is the greatest latitudinarian that has ever filled the office of President. Upon any fair construction of the Constitution, how can the Senate be called upon to record upon its journal any proceedings but its own? It is true that the ordinary messages of the President are usually inserted at large in the journal. Strictly speaking, it perhaps ought never to have been done, but they have been heretofore registered, because they relate to the general business of the Senate, either in its legislative or executive character, and have been the basis of subsequent proceedings. The protest stands upon totally distinct ground. End of Section 1, Part 1.